Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. It is 10 a.m. for us, 9 a.m. for Akhtar. He happens to be in Thailand today. So before we start, some housekeeping. Please post your questions at the end of the session. And also I ask that people try not to type in the chat box until the end of the session, as it can be distracting, and this is what we experienced in the previous sessions. So I'll introduce our guest today. Our guest today is our author, rather. Today is Akhtar Mohammed. He is the writer of Islamonomics, Islamic Finance, Trade, and the Global Muslim Market. Akhtar was born in Vancouver, Canada. First of all, his background is quite interesting. So he was born in Vancouver, Canada, to Fijian Muslim parents of Indian Pashtun descent. He obtained a BA in political science and history from the University of British Columbia, and he got an LLB with honors at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And while living in Singapore, he completed a diploma in Islamic Finance with the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants in the UK. He received his LLM in Toronto at New York University's Osgood Hall Law School, specializing in capital markets. His maternal grandfather was a veteran of the Second World War, serving in the Fijian regiment. Normally at this point, I always ask authors why they wrote their book. But having spoken with you and realizing that A, your first degree was in political science and history, B, you read law at SOAS, which I imagine gave you a lot of insights into Asian-centric and even post-colonial frameworks. And C, you did a diploma in Islamic Finance in Singapore. So I mean, your whole educational pathway seems to have paved the way to writing of this book. Was this book always brewing inside of you, Akhtar?
I think I had lots of questions. When I studied political science and history, it was just Western political science. I wasn't interested really in the Muslim world so much. I just wanted to be the best student I could be. I came to Singapore. I started to learn about Islamic finance, and I had questions about, okay, so what is it? What's different about it? What did it do in the past? And why is it happening now? And I grew up in a quite a religious Islamic home. Like my grandfather taught me Quran when I was 4 or 5 years old in the home. We took Islamic lessons. My dad was involved with the mosque. I never heard of Islamic finance. I heard, and especially after September 11th, I heard about Islamic terrorism. I heard about jihad. I heard of everything negative I heard about. So I was wondering, what is this positive thing that I'm hearing? And how do I get involved, or how do I understand it? So my background in political science and history did shape the questions of what is Islamic finance. And then I took the diploma when I was in Singapore to at least get my understanding of the fundamentals. And then that shaped why I ended up going to SOAS, because there was a professor there who was an expert on the Islamic financial regulation, and how was Islamic finance regulated based off English common law, which was a kind of colonial history and almost a post-colonial possibility. And all of that came together to kind of shape the book, because I had questions, and when I spoke to other people, Muslims and non-Muslims, they had questions that I couldn't answer. So I searched, and I realized other Muslims had these questions or were being asked these questions. So that's how I kind of came to it. But can I expand on my family history? Okay, so growing up, I grew up in Canada. My mom moved there when she was 16 with her sister. My dad moved when he was 21 and went to university. They were born in Fiji. My grandparents were born in Fiji. My great-grandparents were born in northern India, which was the kingdom of Awadh, and then it collapsed, and then we had the British Raj. They were Pashtun, so we're essentially ethnically Afghani, but culturally Indo-Persian Turkic, I guess, the Mughal Empire. So there is an ethnicity, but culturally it's quite different. When this group of people end up going to Fiji, the population in Fiji is split 50% Indian, 50% native Fijian. Amongst the Indians, 95% are Hindu, 5% are Muslim. Amongst the Muslim, 1% are Pashtun. So we're an ultra minority. There's no political development. You're on a little island in the Pacific. Islam essentially is your home. It's your family. It's a very personal experience. And what I didn't realize this until I went to London and I met other Muslims, but I never lived around a majority Muslim population, which is why I think I also enjoy Singapore. I'm used to the minority kind of struggling and thriving. But what ended up happening was when I was in Canada, it was my grandfather taught me to memorize the Quran very young. We had our halal butcher shops and like a few things, but we're some of the first Muslims there. My grandfather and his friends built the mosques, a lot of the first mosques in Vancouver in the 60s and 70s. And I think at that point, because we're such small numbers, the only way you can survive is you practice your faith, but you have to engage with the larger society. There's no choice. And that's all we've ever done for maybe 150 years or so, because we're forced to. It's like survival skill. And it was only when I went to London where I met Muslims who were from a majority Muslim country. And it was there where I realized the conversation of Islam was sometimes around international politics, which was foreign to me. I don't think it's wrong, but I didn't grow up with Sunni Shia divide. I didn't grow up with Israel, Palestine. I didn't grow up with India, Pakistan. It was just learn the substantive religion, practice it, go outside of your house, try to be the best, survive. And that was it. That's all Islam was. And I think this was quite, I was quite fortunate, I think, because I wasn't used to sitting around and debating politics in the mosque, in the prayer room. You pray, you go home or go to school or go to soccer practice. So when I was approaching Islamic finance, I approached the topic outside the realm of international politics, or in a way, outside of whatever was happening the last 150 years of like decolonization, independence movement, all of this. All I was looking at it as, what's the principles? Where does it come from? How is it applied? Why is it happening now? Is there any benefit in the future? And that's it. And when I looked at it that way, it revealed a lot more opportunities and some quite interesting threads of, I guess, interest of, I don't know, how do I say this? There's certain segments of different societies that are quite into Islamic finance, kind of the old colonial British upper class. Tony Blair's older brother, he's a expert on English commercial law. He's very interested in Islamic finance because that group sees the world through the old Silk Roads and the history of the Silk Roads. And they want to re-engage in that world. And they see the future sort of looking like this old world where there is overland trade going from the east to the west, which is very different than, I would say, my experience with, I guess, the decolonial group. So I think after Singapore, And before London, I went to Spain to study with a group of professors at UC Berkeley. And they're experts on Islamophobia. And it was here that I started to see the difference in, so I call it, this is the compartmentalization of knowledge that I talk about, is I was deeply into Islamic finance and I saw opportunities. And I saw a lot of data and statistics saying, okay, these countries are going to grow economically. They're going to do quite well. They might rival the G7 by 2050. And I went to UC, I went to this program in Spain, in Granada, and everyone's sort of, this is the thing about this is 10 years after 9/11, there's an interest in Andalusia and Cordoba and Islamic Spain, and this was Islam in Europe. And I don't know why there's an overemphasis of Islam in Europe, but yeah, okay, Islam in Europe was a big deal. And this was the paved roads and lights and everything great. And I think, okay, I appreciate this. I appreciate that Muslims once did this. And I begin to speak to the Islamophobia professors about Islamic finance. And they don't know anything about it, which I found it quite odd, because I thought these were Muslim professors talking who are interested in the practice of Islam, not the politics of Islam. So I'm sitting there a little bit confused. And I realized that, okay, so one of the arguments being made there was in 1492, when the Spanish kicked out Muslims from Spain, that was the beginning of Islamophobia or anti-Islamic sentiment in Europe. And then that original root of Islamophobia came over to the Americas with the colonization of America and the treatment of Native Americans and African Americans and everything else. So the argument is the root of this happened in 1492, and this is the collapse of, I guess, the heights of Islamic civilization. And I had a tough time with that, to accept it historically. When I was doing my research, I found that in the reason why the Spanish were looking to push out, or the end of Andalusia at that time, was because the Ottoman Empire had defeated the Eastern Holy Roman Empire in about 1470. They had taken over Constantinople, it became Istanbul, and they effectively cut off continental Europe from trade to the east, where is all the wealth was in the world. This wasn't the fear of, this wasn't the collapse of Islam with the end of Andalusia. It was actually a point of relative strength. You had the Battle of Vienna almost 100 years later. You have Safavid, Persia, the Mughal Empire. Islam in Southeast Asia is thriving. You had this spice routes and spice trade. And what I began to see is one of the problems with the field or the study of Islamophobia and the difference with Islamic finance was I would constantly hear the arguments of Marxism in Islamophobia or Islamophobic critiques or in their explanation. And what I mean by this is in Marxist thought, and sorry, I'll back up a bit. The reason why this sounds quite foreign to me is because my family never lived in a majority Muslim country. There wasn't ever a mix of Islamic politics, Marxist revolutionary fervor for national independence, which many Muslim countries went through in the 50s and 60s. It mixed for political reasons. And we never went through that. It was cut sugarcane in Fiji or die. And you just cut it and made sure that somebody in your family became educated so you can climb up. There's no masses movement. It's a very simple equation. So what I began to hear was okay, the Muslims are oppressed. Okay, well, where? Oh, could look at Iraq, look at Afghanistan. Okay, but are they being oppressed because they're Muslim? Or are they being oppressed because of natural resources in the same way the Vietnamese were oppressed, or Laos, or many other places in the world that are also oppressed, but they're not Muslim? And I kept on, the way I describe it is a certain Marxist type of argument will begin to appropriate the suffering of the masses. There's a belief in Marxism that there's a brotherhood of workers internationally, and the suffering of one worker ends up being a reflection of the suffering of the other. And unless the proletariat unite collectively, they can only overcome international capitalism. And I would see that argument being applied to Muslims, that if a Muslim suffering here, then a Muslim suffering there. And it's the same, and we need to unite to overcome the oppressor. And maybe it gets reconstituted into the metaphysical ummah or something. And it seems like it's there in Islam. It seems like that argument is there. Maybe you can find that it does exist. I do believe the concept of the ummah, but in terms of political unit, that suffering is one and the other. I found it was the root of the study of Islamophobia was a reconstitution of this type of Marxism, which then leads out any possibility of perhaps regional based trade for increasing standards of living, which is what I'm more interested in. So Islamic finance gets kind of pushed aside because it would counter that narrative. If in the last 50 years, Islamic finance has grown, and actually many our opportunities in the global stage have increased, and there is some sort of alternative financial system being developed, or somewhat alternative, then it would counter the argument that Muslims are all being oppressed globally everywhere. So I found that made me, my experience with the Islamophobia professors in the field made me far more interested in Islamic finance, because I could see opportunities and yet they weren't being highlighted, or they weren't as important, I guess. Can I keep on going? Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that about your observations of Marxism, because I remember when Sheikh Hamza was in Singapore, he was speaking in the bookshop, and he mentioned that a lot of modern Muslims are actually unknowingly crypto-Marxists.
Yeah.
So I never got that connection until you spoke about this whole capitalism and hegemonic kind of views. So, interesting.
Yeah, I would constantly hear it. It was all usually many Muslims from countries that went through independence movements, and it lingered, and they would kind of connect one or the other. And when I would speak to them about Islamic finance, they're usually very hesitant in a very Marxist argument. Like most Marxists end up arguing, if you allow for any form of engagement with capitalism, it eventually erode your Marxist movement. And this is where there's also that belief of, well, if Islamic finance engages with the West, or if there's 1% interest, you've collapsed the entire legitimacy of Islamic finance, and now you're being appropriated, and this would delegitimize your movement. And when I look at the historic practice of Islamic finance or Islamic trade, one of the great benefits of it is that initially there are no Muslims in the sense of the prophecy to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Everyone essentially becomes a Muslim. I mean, I know we're all born, but I mean in the proper label of it. So it has to include people who were once not a part of the faith, just naturally. When it expands, and it famously expands to conquer twice the territory of the Roman Empire in half the time, those are all new people, essentially, new people joining in, partaking in trade, into a tax system, into a legal system, being granted new rights. But my main focus was on the adoption of what would, beyond the spiritual element, which I cannot prove why someone would want to become a Muslim at that time. It's very hard for me to find evidence for that going back. But what I find was everywhere Islam began to spread, and this is my favorite part of the book, I call it Pax Islamica, that as Islam spreads, there's a robust economic system that can be practiced in substance by many people who were once not Muslims. And then they embrace it. They might set up their own sultanate or kingdom. They standardize their coins, the dinar and dirham, gold coins. They set up a very lucrative tax system. They open the society to many Muslims and non-Muslims to facilitate trade, to bring trade to the region. And then it spreads. At one point, in the 1600s, you're looking at from the tip of Singapore, Indonesia, all the way to North Africa. And everywhere in between is kind of like a snake of trade going through in between the East, the Far East, Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Europe. That wasn't my fascination with that wasn't a single entity. It wasn't like the United States of America. And this is also what I found when I would discuss the history of Islamic trade and why I end up writing, I think, 30,000 words about it, is because many young Muslims I met would want, or the hope would be that Islam would somehow rival the United States of America or Europe or something like this. And I couldn't find any evidence of a single entity. There wasn't ever a single caliphate, United States of the Ummah, nothing. There were competing sultanates, there were competing systems. However, in substance, they're practicing the faith, which is, for me, my main concern. I'm not politically aligned to any country or any place, but they're substantively practicing the faith, and it allows it to spread and facilitate trade. And my argument that I make in the book I think is quite obvious, but it sounds controversial, is that Islamic finance is economically liberal. And this is very different than, and what I mean by that is there isn't a overseeing centralized body that would control Islamic trade in Malaysia in the 1700s, and they didn't have to pay their money back to Mecca. It never happened. In the way you would have to, during the heights of colonization, money flowed back to London, money flowed back to Paris, money flowed back to the metropoles of colonial powers or imperial powers. This doesn't happen. Money stays where it's produced. And that is, depending on how you look at it, is either a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's a good thing because you don't have a centralized body. There isn't a single economic power that is collecting all the wealth, but it's practiced in substance throughout all of these regions, which allows them to adjust to local, I guess, indicators. And this, I found it quite fascinating in that it allows the religion to constantly be adaptable, allows trade to adapt, empires would rise and fall, and it stays in practice until about the end of the Second World War is when I could say definitively Islamic finance now is almost obliterated because that's the end of the Ottoman Empire. But prior to that, it thrived. So I sort of defined Pax Islamica from 632 to like 1919, which is fascinating and quite a success story if you think of a system of trade. Yeah. Should I just keep on going, or more questions? Or yeah, okay. So I should talk about compartmentalization knowledge a little bit. And so I got into the Islamophobia topic a bit, but so one of the things that would happen in London was, so I started a student society on Islamic Finance and Ethics Society. We started at SOAS, we spread to LSE, UCL, King's College. We did a couple of events with Oxford and Cass Business School. So we hosted 10 to 15 lectures, invited all the professors, Muslims, non-Muslims, to speak about the topic: economic reform, income inequality, Sharia compliance, anything. Just to unite, or to like bring together all the speakers, and then expose the like young students that in order to affect change, you need a lot more nuance. Because the thing I kept on hearing was either simplistic terms, the West, it's the West that does this. It was colonization that did it. And therefore, Islam will solve it. And with this is I guess my political science background is, I'm wondering, well, what do you mean by that? Who's the West? Is Poland the same as United States of America? Because they're very different. What do you mean by colonization? And who was it? It wasn't England. It didn't just colonize India. It was a British East India Company. And at each point, I was pressing the students, get into specifics. You need to get into specifics, because if you don't know what you're talking about. And also you won't know how to come up with a solution because you don't know the problem. So at these events, that was the purpose of having the events. At the events, I usually get a young Muslim brother, maybe sometimes a little bit older, come up to me and say, brother, this is all haram. So what do you mean all haram? Oh, there's interest involved. Okay, so then, okay, valid point. What do you think? You shouldn't be involved with this. This is all haram. Okay. So what do you suggest I do? Drop out of law school and, I don't know, drive a taxi or something? And he's like, oh no, I tried to go to the Islamic Bank of Britain to take out a mortgage and they charged me interest. I said, okay, there's a reason why it's hard to get around interest. Like, it's nearly impossible unless you have full equity or whatever, but they are trying to help. I think they're more a part of the solution than a part of the problem. And there's reasons why it's hard to get around interest, like nearly impossible, but that's a very difficult thing to do. So I said, well, so then what do you do? He said, oh, I'll just rent. I said, so I'm saying, so my question ends up becoming, so you want every single Muslim to not own a home and rent and never build equity and never pass on generational wealth. So you're essentially saying the Muslims in the UK should be a perpetual underclass. That's a terrible policy decision. And this is where I would find, okay, fine, you want to make I wouldn't say conservative, but almost, you want to make a hardline position on just a legal principle, just one legal principle. And there's a Dr. Mehmet Usate, who's a Turkish professor at the University of Durham in Islamic Finance. He calls this the fiqh approach, just the Islamic law approach. And they will take, it works. There's two ways that it ends up working negatively, but it would say the validity of a contract is whether it was haram or halal, or like legally permissible. And the problem with that is that doesn't necessarily explain whether this is a good policy decision. And this is one of the things I like about Islamic finance over my experience with Islamic philosophy. I enjoy Islamic philosophy. I think it's great. I think it stimulates my mind, and I understand things in a way perhaps I didn't understand in the past. The difference with Islamic finance is, I think it's like, it takes a form of Islamic philosophy in it, and you have to apply it. So there is public policy. And you have to think of yourself, of your decision in the wider aggregate. if you were to aggregate all of these decisions together, what would be the outcome for a community? So I would get this brother who would go through this and tell me, okay, you shouldn't do this and it's wrong. And eventually I get to the point where I ask him, so do you own a home? He said, yeah, I do. Do you have a mortgage? Oh, actually, yes, brother, I do. From where? Oh, HSBC. And it's because, and what I found was there's like a persona of claiming outwardly that you're very hardline and therefore more Muslim. The harder position, the more strict you are in a theoretical position, meant you're more pious, typically leading to quite absurd outcomes. So instead of helping a burgeoning Islamic institutions using your money to help a Muslim business so he can go and help his kids go to school and maybe save up for university, all of these things, you just said, no, they have 1% interest. And if Muslims do that, then it's wrong. Therefore, I'll rather just go to HSBC because guess what? I consider them haram anyways. And I'd rather just do that. So I would get, that would happen often. Almost every event, same type of person, young guy. There's usually older guys as well who just show up. And I found that quite odd because I didn't grow up with it, but I found it quite prominent. Then there's a second example. So that's a part of the compartmentalization of knowledge. That's what where Islamic finance or Islamic actions gets broken down to whether something is legally permissible or not. And typically the person will be willing to go find hadith and narration chains and debate you for hours about why what you're doing is wrong. And I usually walk away from it, but it's a kind of a typical thing. So this happened. There's another example of this, which shaped why I wrote my book in the way I did. There was another event where we hosted Mufti Muhammad Taqi Usmani, who is arguably the most influential Islamic scholar. He sits on the board of most banks and Islamic financial institutions as well. So we're at this event. There's someone in the audience, and they quite strongly stood up and asked Mufti, said, Mufti, when the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt came into power, you advised them to accept a $500 million IMF loan with 1% interest. How dare you corrupt the pious Muslims of Egypt? This is in a lecture hall of about 300 people. I thought it was quite an offensive question and a little bit, okay, if I were to say a little bit ignorant, but it was harsh. It was almost like questioning his religiosity. So he calmly takes a sip of his water and then he gives an answer. He says, the Muslim Brotherhood was a Islamic party that came into power after a long time. This was after the Egyptian revolution. The agricultural sector collapsed. The foreign reserves collapsed because we stopped exporting. And the country is an agricultural country. Exports a lot of cotton, a lot of stuff along the Nile. Very fertile, but it's a farming country. If the farmers were devastated after the revolution, because things weren't flowing, exports weren't happening, people weren't trading, people were going hungry. So the question ends up becoming, if we do not give them subsidies and help them to get food on the table, what will happen, there is a number of consequences to this. By claiming we're so pious that we don't take 1% interest, we're willing to let millions of people die while we eat. The people who can make decisions will eat, but the farmers will die or eventually go hungry. Their kids will go hungry. You're essentially allowing people will grow up, or what they'll take away from this is that Muslim parties can't govern. They don't make sound economic decisions. You'll never become into power ever again. That's the domestic consequences. The international consequences is people from the West will say, I told you so. They can't govern because they cloud sound rational thought and policy decisions with simple legal analysis that says 1% interest is haram. And that is another aggregate example of one of the difficulties and one of the good things I find when dealing with Islamic finances is one of the fields where you can make policy decisions and you have to engage with consequences. Because what I find with, I mean, after September 11th, there was a lot of questions. Is Islam secular enough? Is it liberal enough? And those conversations are sometimes quite metaphysical. Is the Muslim community doing well or not because it is liberal or not liberal? Are there too many liberals? Are there too many Muslim liberals? I'm not sure whether that there is a study to suggest that, or that can explain the reason why, the sole reason why Muslims in a certain country or community is economically worse off than another community is because of where it sits on the conservative or liberal spectrum. There might be many other variables. The point of migration of the parents, the city that they move to, whether the larger city that they move to also is not that well off because of outsourcing, because of like in the 70s and 80s, because of the wave of migration. There's many other issues other than whether you're conservative or liberal. But that debate almost ends up going nowhere, I find. What I find interesting with Islamic finance is there is a way of saying, okay, can we set up a pension fund for the workers? Can we set up an education fund? Can we set up something that helps you at least get a piece of the pie to engage in so you can now make better, like more sound financial decisions for your family or your community or your country? Within that, if you can begin to have more economic autonomy, I think you might be able to resolve some of your conservative or liberal questions. And those questions seem to come up without the initial part of, are these communities economically sustainable or well off enough to then even question this? So that was one of the things that led me to write extensively about the history of Islam, of showing the context of Islamic trade, to try to get people to understand there are external factors and internal factors that lead to either the success or failure of Islamic trade. So one of the examples I give is in 632, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, receives a revelation. And when I was in London, I took Islamic studies classes with some sheikhs. And it's interesting because we have reverence for that period of time. It is the most important aspect to our religion. Yet it doesn't mean that it was economically the wealthiest society. And I think that's a very important point. We're not drawn to it for economic wealth or political power. It's a spiritual movement and a religious movement with law and rules and all of that. But I'm not looking to that example for a United States of America or the heights of a civilization. It's actually quite opposite. And I hope I don't offend anyone. To me, it's a man in a cave meditating, seeking guidance. There's nothing beyond that. It's quite a simple thing that anyone can relate to. What I would find is when I was explaining Islamic finance and the, I guess, re-emergence of it, I would constantly meet a similar argument of this is when Muslims are going to dominate the world once again. And then I looked for the evidence. When did that happen? When was it during the time of revelation? No, it wasn't. Was it when you had the Abbasids or Cordoba? No, it wasn't then either. There were still other economic powers. So at that point, I use statistics throughout the book from Angus Madison, who is a professor of economic history. He passed away recently, and he has a book called Contours of the World Economy from year 1 to 2030, and looks at the top economic powers throughout that period. From about year 1 to 1850, it's pretty much India, China, 1 and 2, big populations, engines of growth and trade. 1850, you get the British. They had the Industrial Revolution. Things move quite quickly to Europe. 1920, it's America. By 1950, it starts to come back. By 2010, India and China are close. America's there. Things are kind of looking the way it used to. And the reason why I use that is to sort of frame the mind of the reader. Yes, we care a lot about Islam. Yes, we care a lot about our religion. That doesn't necessarily mean we were or we have to be the wealthiest people on the planet or the most advanced civilization. It's also a spiritual religion. There's a way that we conduct business. There's a way that we go about things. And the world, what I try to contextualize is, even today, that 1.6 million or billion Muslim population essentially were historic facilitators of the Silk Road. If you look at the map of the world and you look at the Muslim population, you get China, Russia, India, and then there you go in between, just snaking in between towards Europe, and then sub-Saharan Africa is a big Muslim population. That's the historic role that Islam played in trade. It explains a lot. So as long as the engines of growth, of economic growth, and China and India and Europe is there as an end purchaser, and these two places are manufacturing, you get that whole area where most Muslims live becomes vital once again, overland trade. So then I go through this point of saying, yes, okay, look, this is what happens. Colonization slowly begins to happen. It doesn't really affect the Muslim world for a couple hundred years because there isn't an asymmetry of power. The Portuguese are there in the 1500s, they struggle. The Spanish come, they struggle. The Dutch come, they struggle. The English come, they struggle. It's only with the Industrial Revolution, when you get the steam engine in the 1850s, that you begin to see a huge asymmetry, not just with the Muslim world. It isn't like just a psychological effect on the Muslim world. It's Japan, China, everybody else all of a sudden falls behind Western Europe and then later America. And the most significant part, I think, is the American century. Because as that happens, this isn't specifically against an American mindset or something. It's that America is not a part of Eurasia. It's an island almost out there. It doesn't facilitate overland trade. What it ends up doing is sets up port systems to ship out. And which kind of the British were doing as well, because they don't facilitate overland trade. But that's why you get Hong Kong, Singapore, Macau, you get Bombay, you get Karachi, you get port cities. And everything gets developed, or agriculture gets developed, resources get developed, go on trains out to the port and out. So countries like Kazakhstan are almost pointless in this American system. No one cares about Kazakhstan. No one cares about Uzbekistan. You go there, you think, okay, Bukhara, this is nice. How did you guys have money 1,000 years ago? Because it doesn't, like, even for me, it didn't seem to make sense. What ends up happening, and this isn't, what I'm about to say next isn't necessarily a pro-China movement or pro-India movement, is that as China becomes wealthy again, or becomes an engine of economic growth, as India does as well, it reignites that system of trade. So now overland areas become important once again. The Americans essentially have a navy that controls the seaways. You want to overcome that, you go overland, as you did for 2,000 years. And the geography set up to go overland. If you go overland, you're going to end up running into huge Muslim populations who used to do this. It's just a overly simplistic way of looking at the world, but you see that Belt and Road initiatives are coming through. It goes overland. And it's one of the things that so I write about this huge section because I'm trying to get over a sort of I think Panjak Mishra calls it like the psychology of colonization, the feeling of feeling inferior but not knowing why. So I'd met, especially in London, I met a lot of Muslims who would try to explain like, well, we were once great and then we weren't. And I don't know what happened. And you say, oh, it was a closure of the gates to ijtihad. It was there's all of these arguments. And I sort of look around, and this is why I enjoy statistics. And it's sort of, instead of going through the whole emotional point of trying to understand why this happened, you look and say, well, nobody else could do this either, could deal with the Industrial Revolution. Nobody else in the 1800s could really deal with the technological power of Western Europe at that time. So things didn't just fall apart for Muslims. It mostly fell apart for everybody. And that kind of gives me a bit of comfort in a way, because it means it isn't necessarily an Islamic problem. It isn't as if Islam failed. If there is something that can be questioned, and I think this is a bit of my why I am optimistic about Islamic finance, and a little bit, I think Ibrahim, I talked about this, the overemphasis on like the 10th century or the golden age. The reason why I'm not such a big fan of that is I don't know if, how do I say this like very politely? I find it's romanticizing a period in the way that Europeans used to romanticize the Greeks and Plato and Aristotle. It's a way of, the way my analogy is this. After the 2008 global financial crisis, there was, Greece was heavily indebted and they couldn't pay their pensions or anything like that. Imagine if the leaders of Greek society came to them and said, oh, people of Greece, read Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. There are great thinkers from the great golden age that will solve your problem of indebtedness due to derivatives and futures and swaps options on Wall Street. I don't think it's going to help you. It might make you feel good that you were once great, because today you're not. But I don't know if it's good to have. It's very important to have an idea that you were once a part of a great civilization. And overemphasis on that typically means you're living in the past without an understanding that there is a huge opportunity in front of you today to maybe recreate something. So that, so I'm not against it. I just don't like when it becomes a sole focus of we were once great. But yeah, that's a little bit of my, Ibrahim, you can say something if you like. I feel like I can feel your thoughts.
No, yeah, it's just it's always refreshing to hear you speak. It's always surprising the insights that you have. A lot of light bulbs go up in my head. So thank you for that. And when you're coming back to Singapore?
If things open up, I was thinking about hoping maybe I can do something in store, but we'll see.
Maybe it's a good time to open up, and then
yeah,
if anyone has a question, you can either unmute yourself or you can put in the chat.
I'm very friendly, and you can ask me anything from Islamic finance to how I got the publishing contract or how to write a book. It, what's it like living in Canada?
Hi, Akhtar.
Hey,
Thanks for the enlightening talk. Yeah, it's actually a really interesting book for me because I just finished my honors thesis on. I wrote about zakat in Singapore.
okay, wow.
Yeah, and trying to look at the political philosophy aspect of zakat that you can apply to secular countries.
Mm-hmm.
So this book was actually like all the writers like Will Halak, Muhammad Hashim Kamali, like Muhammad Yunus, all these names. I was like, whoa, all these people I've been reading. But there was one question that I had with regards to Islamic finance, especially in the context of, well, not necessarily secular countries, but in terms of the global economy.
Mm.
It has to do with the fact that when you talk about an ethical form of finance like Islamic finance, in comparison with what people already have in conventional finance, because I feel like I've heard people talk about, oh, Islamic finance is the same as conventional finance but with more steps. I've literally heard someone say that before.
Yeah.
So in my head, it's like there is this idea that if you're only concerned with financial incentive, there is a lot of opportunity cost to be lost when you actually engage in things like ethical finance or Islamic finance. So how do you suppose like the kind of hurdle can be overcome, with moving forward with like the future of Islamic finance and all this?
Yeah, okay. This is a good question. This comes up at a lot of the Islamic finance conferences. So one of the critiques by a lot of non-Muslims when they say is pretty much what ends up happening is you might get a number of equity-based investors and they want to invest in a project. And so they'll come along and say, oh, this is, or they are a seller. So they say, okay, we're selling this thing. You want to finance through Islamic finance, you're Islamic finance purchaser. And they'll say, okay, we believe that this is ethical and that's good, but how come we have to pay more for like there's the extra step of Sharia compliance? And then the question is it more ethical? And I think this is a good thing that happens because for a lot of Muslims, we presume if it's Islamic, it's ethical. That's the presumption. With, I think I do think I write this in the book, but there is like impact investing in the United States actually ends up having more steps in screening their either the companies, the stocks, making sure that they're not indebted, making sure that investments don't go into, I think initially started with investors in California not wanting to invest in apartheid South Africa. So that was the first form of like ethical investments. So I think it exists. It's interesting who the I say the interlocutor, who the person you're speaking to is. I noticed that growing up in Canada, especially Vancouver, there's a lot of the conscious investors. They don't mind paying more for ethical investments. In California, you get it as well. A lot of like more socially conscious. And I think whereas I think when I was in Singapore and I spoke to people, it is less of a concern. It's why would I pay more to get a lower rate of return? So I don't think you will, it's a reflection of the other person than the system itself. For certain people, a lot of German investors and California investors, and maybe liberally progressive, they see it as a marker of being forward thinking and being visionary. Look at us, we invest in ethical investments. Islamic finance does this. We're willing to pay the premium because we're going to save the planet, because it's a sustainable investment. That group sees it as that. For other groups, they don't value that. This is liberal progressive stuff. This isn't how we built empires in the past. You're going to have to maximize your profit margin now and ruthlessly build. And what I realize is, I think at least the Islamic finance industry should stay true to its principles, because I think the ethical, sustainable finance group will end up coming out on top just because it seems to work. But it's more of a reflection of the values of that person you're speaking to. And it's just kind of impossible to overcome because they're set in their mindset, and that's fine. But yeah, did I answer the question?
Yeah, actually, it was interesting that you brought up impact investing. So I mean, because I did an internship at the impact investment firm last year, and I realized that there were kind of a similar thread that you find as a problem for Islamic finance, as well as more novel forms of or novel approaches to investing, like impact investing. It's where it's not it's very easy to tell someone, like, you know, you should invest in socially or environmentally good things. But for a lot of people, I suppose, maybe not individuals, but perhaps maybe companies or hedge funds who are fiduciary to their clients, so they're not necessarily responsible for their own money, all the money that they use. So they cannot randomly just, oh, I like this cause, I'm gonna invest in this thing. So that automatically translates into a form of financial prudence for them. And I guess like the question was based on this idea that I had with that, where these structures are so deeply ingrained, like some people might have even said that capitalism has been so deeply entrenched that it's impossible to overcome, almost, you know, which I don't necessarily think is the case, but like, yeah.
I mean, I'd say it's a form of capitalism that's difficult. One of the things I find quite interesting, and because I got into this a lot in London, was there's many things about, and this is why I give the history of Islam, is there's many things about capitalism that might have started with Islam. And there's a professor who argues this. And this is where the crypto Marxist, Muslim Marxist thing begins to implode, because yes, there's a social justice element, Muslim suffering, but a part of that is a critique of, like, a all-out critique of capitalism. The idea that you have private property rights and these sort of things, I call it pre-industrial capitalism, before industries, before 1850-ish. Most of that is quite compatible with Islamic finance. It's what we specifically seem to have a problem with is the use of industrialization to either exploit workers and to exploit labor, to dominate nature and increase income inequality. So what I find is Islamic finance might be a niche thing that helps push the alternative or more novel investments to maybe the mainstream. But I think that's a good place to be. I almost see Islamic finance almost like California startup culture in the 1970s, 1980s. People didn't believe in that. Wall Street was not believing in these long hair hippie kids who are into science and computers. And this is why I think growing up in California, or not California, on the West Coast, having lots of friends in California, it changes my mindset. Yes, it's small. Yes, you're ethical. Yes, you're novel, but that's good. You're agile, and you're in a startup phase. And I feel like Islamic finance kind of is in that phase. It just it needs to embrace that kind of underdog mentality, maybe. But I think we're on the right side of things. There should be a lot of convergence with impact investment, and it might be the current institutional investors might miss out on the opportunity. And maybe we gladly say, fine, you guys missed out on the reemergence of the world. But yeah.
All right, thanks. And I think someone else had a question.
Sorry, Farouk, Ibrahim here. So you were saying that you wrote a book on this?
No. This it's an undergraduate thesis.
Oh, right. Right.
I'm graduating in May, yeah. So
I was wondering how come I missed this book. Right. Thank you for your questions. Anyone else?
I thought I saw a hand go up. And then
Yeah, I thought I saw Farid's hand.
Thanks, Akhtar and Farouk, and also Ibrahim for the discussion. But then I think just to add onto the discussion, just to give some sort of point of view, looking from the Maqasid framework, right? The five Maqasid. I think ESG investing and also Islamic finance can be complementary towards each other to achieve the Maqasid actually, because sorry to be quite pessimist in Islamic finance, because we see some sort of governance issue, especially some sort of like sukuk issuance. Even 1MDB issues sukuks. So probably ESG, ESG investing can some sort of sort that problem. Like Islamic finance it's not only just a way to legalize, just to legalize some sort of, borrowing. Yes.
Can I jump in, or?
Yeah, please.
No, you can. So let me just try to summarize. Your point is Maqasid framework can be used to I guess implement like an ethical framework for Islamic finance and maybe overcome governance issues.
So probably, yes, investing can be complementary to Islamic finance, because I think Islamic finance has been lost its way recently. It's just one way to legalize, interest. But then I completely get the idea that Islamic finance really, in a way, Sharia compliant because of a lot of structure. You can say that there's mudarabah, murabaha, tawaruk, and all that. And I'm not a fiqh scholar to comment on that. Yeah. So.
Yeah, me neither. So
yeah, so it's all about the principle, and then the objective of the Sharia to achieve that. Mainly back to
okay, I'll make 2 points. Right.
Thank you.
I agree. I think the Maqasid framework is probably what would push Islamic finance to be a value add. And this is where I mean, Dr. Mehmet Wisate, he writes a lot about this at Durham, that solely focusing on whether something is permissible or not, so whether interest is or not permissible, defeats the value add of Islamic finance, because Islamic finance is trying to say we're engaging in a moral economy. And so there should be a moral outcome or an ethical outcome, not just you're claiming spiritually you're morally clean. That's kind of the attitude. Okay, I did not partake in interest, or I was able to mitigate interest, and therefore this is okay. So I think the Maqasid framework does push it. It's almost equivalent to some ESG frameworks or impact investing frameworks. No, it's fine. I think that, I agree with you with that. The second point on Islamic finance losing its way, I would say in part yes, in part no. But yeah, I'd say that, okay, so the reason why I think it begins to lose its way is probably because of how it's marketed, right? So when Islamic finance starts to reemerge in the 60s and 70s, that's the era of the Cold War, and it's Anglo-Western capitalism and Soviet communism. And when a lot of the early intellectual leaders of Islamic finance came about, the way they describe it is, this is the third way. This is a way of engaging in, you can own private property like capitalism, but we don't charge interest. And they overly emphasize not charging interest as the distinguishing factor between Islamic finance and all other finance, whether it's capitalism, communism. And this kind of narrative stuck. So what ends up happening is, today, if a bank charges admin fees, an Islamic bank charges admin fees, usually customers are quite upset because they said, well, you're just masking interest. And therefore, all of this is pointless because it's only about interest. And I'll explain why this is it limits the benefit of Islamic finance. So there's normally a few principles. So it's not supposed to be interest-based. It's meant to be asset-backed. The investment's meant to go into something tangible, and it can't go into something prohibited. Now, I think 2 and 3 in the current global economy is the most important. So when I met with, when Boris Johnson was the mayor of the city of London, I met his chief economic advisor, and he's at an Islamic Finance conference, and I asked him, okay, why do you care about Islamic finance? Like, why are you here? And he said, the city of London needs £5 trillion of infrastructure investment by 2050. And if we don't get this, London will fall apart. And the only people who invest are the Islamic finance guys. And I said, oh, how come? Well, one, they probably should invest probably somewhere else, maybe in schools or something, but why infrastructure? And he said, they have asset-backed investments because usually they're countries that have sold oil or natural resources. And 2, they have to invest in something tangible, infrastructure, roads, factories, something. It creates jobs, it builds society. And that currently, that ends up being the biggest value add. This is also, I was watching a documentary a couple of days ago by PBS, the American Broadcasting Network. They have a thing called Frontline about the Federal Reserve. And this is another problem in the global economy, that after the financial crisis, you had quantitative easing, which is now called modern monetary theory, where they pump out tons of money and lower interest rates to incentivize borrowing. The presumption was this would lead to people like companies taking out cheap loans, building factories and getting people back to work, which would help the people at the bottom to increase their standard of living. That did not happen. Most corporations bought stock buybacks. They invested in derivatives or whatever. You get NFTs, Bitcoin, all of those things. In my kind of critique, I'll get into my critique of NFT and Bitcoin after, but a lot of those things is not going into the real economy. And I think that should have been the greater sell of Islamic finance. And I think that should be the sell of Islamic finance going forward. It's nearly impossible to get around interest. It just, like, it's so difficult. You're either creating your own, if you were to try to get around it, you'd end up like Iran or North Korea. You'd cut yourself. Like, that's the politics. That's the real consequence of it. I think you mitigate it as much as you can. Try to get into equity investments. But the value add of Islamic finance is we take assets and we put it into real stuff. We invest in real things that put people to work. And for some of the top central bankers, they would agree. This is the one problem that they can't solve in America. This is a problem that's very difficult to solve in Europe, is all of this cheap money was around. How come we didn't build factories? Why didn't we get people back to work? So I find the interest part is, yes, it's important. You're not supposed to do it. We can't partake in it. It's so hard to get around. I don't know, maybe, I don't know how we do it. Like, I find it fascinating to think through. I don't know how to do it. However, I do see 2 aspects of it, of the principles that solve one of the biggest problems right now. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I agree. I think it has lost its way because of the interest and marketing of admin fees, because it seems like you're lying to people. That's not good. Secondly, kind of lost its way because a lot of the investments, the big money sovereign wealth funds, goes towards luxury real estate and like football clubs. So like PSG, Manchester City, Newcastle, that's all Islamic finance as well. Which is why the Maqasid framework of saying, well, is the Saudi sovereign wealth fund meant to buy Newcastle? Is that where that money should go right now? And I don't know if non-Saudis should agree or disagree or what it may be, but I like that in the industry, you can have that conversation. But yeah. Did I answer the question? No, kind of.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks for your input. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, it should be Islamic finance should be value adding,
Yeah,
not value destruction lah. Yeah, so basically all the let's say all the financing needs to be towards yeah, it should be value adding. Yeah.
yeah. And I think it seems simple. It seems like, of course, we claim the religion to be ethical and moral. The financing should be ethical and moral in its outcome. But like that Dr. Mehmet Usate said, just focusing on whether it's Sharia compliant actually is a very low threshold, because you can have Sharia compliance and not be ethical in your outcome.
So what do you think about let's say borrowing for consumption? For example, like all these credit card issued by Islamic banks.
I mean, I personally am not a fan of it. I do prepaid as much as I can. If somebody's in a, I don't know, like what ends up happening is someone's in a difficult situation. Should you take out debt? Probably not. The argument ends up being credit was one of the great expansions of lifting very, very poor people out of poverty, because at least in Europe, it was lack of access to credit kept people in, like, they could only borrow from like the landed elite, essentially. So there, the Western argument is credit actually got rid of a landed elite in a feudal underclass system. I think the problem today is, and if you look at the United States, it's overly indebted societies, overly relying on it. So I don't want to critique a certain bank. I personally feel indebtedness is not good, because if something happens, you're highly leveraged. However, there are a lot of Islamic scholars that say it's okay, but I look at it from a larger policy perspective, that indebtedness is probably at least frowned upon, but something to avoid, perhaps. But yeah, I think what, like, so I think I used to talk to the guys at Islamic Bank of Britain, and they offer like Islamic credit cards. And their thing is, from their market research, Muslims have credit cards. Just they have it. So we're just trying to give them it from our bank, because they have checkings account and savings account with us, but they get the credit card from HSBC. So we want to bring them into one thing. So this is a bit of like what I like, the Muslim brother who comes up to me and says, oh no, you shouldn't take out a mortgage, and he has a mortgage with HSBC. It's kind of similar. It's so hard to avoid that most Muslims do it, but they don't want to do it with the Islamic bank, because it's like the Islamic bank is doing haram stuff, but HSBC does it anyway, so I'll go do it there, or UOB or DBS or whatever. And I think what the Islamic finance industry, or some of the banks, at least the Islamic Bank of Britain, what they were trying to say is, we're just trying to get people to mitigate these harms. Maybe they will come to us, take out a credit card, and we'll keep the interest rates lower than HSBC. We'll encourage them to pay. We'll increase their savings. It's almost a financial mitigation lifestyle rather than strict observance, because what they find is with strict observance, people hide and take the credit card somewhere else. And it's a very difficult thing, because you're not supposed to do it, but people are doing it, and they do it quite rampantly. So, and I think, so that's where I don't tell people what they can and cannot do, and I don't critique the bank, but I think there's a context. I think Muslims, like many Muslims are doing, especially since most Muslims in most countries are at least in the middle or lower middle class economically. And that group tends to borrow because they don't have access to equity or generational wealth, which is why my way of solving it actually might take a generation or two. It might mean you have retirement savings, education savings, and savings plans. So then the next generation has family equity. So like in England, a lot of the generationally wealthy families don't take out loans, And if they do, they're so wealthy, they can take it at 0 interest because the family has tons of equity in land and property. Most Muslims, we haven't had that for other reasons: independence, colonization, lack of financial awareness. So I think if you're going to really solve the credit card problem, it would be mitigate it now as much as you can, try to build equity within a family, and help the family then become essentially, a lot of the well-to-do families are their own equity, like private equity funds, because they hold so much equity themselves, they don't need a loan. And when they do, it's 0%. So it's sort of try to create a mini version of that. But I think, yeah, I think it's a bit like, and I think that's what I think with Islamic finance policies, it has to be almost generational, because HSBC is 200 years old. A lot of the banks they're hundreds of years old. They've done this for a long time. They're in the position they are now because they did it for a while. It will take a foresight of a young generation to understand they're in a startup stage, to then hopefully pass on lessons to the next one, rather than we don't do it. But yeah, that's, sorry. I get excited talking about it.
You were alluding to it earlier when you were talking about how Muslims should invest in concrete stuff. So I'm not asking for fatwa, but what is your take on the movement towards things like Bitcoin and non-fungible, or whatchamacallit?
Yeah. So with Bitcoin, I remember I went to, when I was in London, I was being mentored by Tariq Al-Dawani, who helped me out a lot. He was kind of one of the London guys in Islamic finance. We went to a conference with, I think, the third in command at Bitcoin. We don't know who Satoshi is, but like one of the guys. And it was interesting because Tariq Al-Dawani, there's a position that the problem isn't just interest. The problem is fiat currency, paper currency. Paper currency allows you to create value out of nothing. And this is a problem, especially since we're supposed to use commodity backed, like gold coins, gold, silver. So following that line of thought, Bitcoin seemed to be a solution because there was a restricted supply, and therefore value was based off demand. I think there's like 20 million Bitcoin, and based off who wants it, value goes up or down. In theory, that seems to work. When we met the Bitcoin guy and where they're having a conversation, the practical reality of it comes out, where the guy argues, yeah, if you, Bitcoin's great because if there's sanctions against Iran, you can send Bitcoin. But it's also used for human trafficking because it's hard to track. And that is a part of the problem is, yes, you can use Bitcoin for, so, okay, that's initial Bitcoin. This is before the crypto explosion. So it seemed like it was a solution to fiat currency, but it's also something very hard to regulate. Regulation has picked up. It seems like it's much better now. The problem I find with, I guess, the crypto world is it seems to have very little value add as a currency. The point is, should we use this as a currency? And it seems to be more of a store of value, that like a stock that you invest in. You hope Bitcoin goes up from $5 to $40,000, and then you sell it at 40,000. That seems more like speculation off of a new industry that has no real value. So maybe as a payment system, it had potential, but it seems like it's more of a speculative investment. And if people want to do it, then fine. It's not for me. I think there's a lot more value add in trying to build roads and stuff, get people to school, get them food. In terms of NFT, I think it's probably, I'm far more against it. And the reason why, and it goes back to the conversation with when Boris Johnson was the mayor of London, his chief economic advisor. Cities need money for infrastructure, and people with extra cash are throwing it to create a fantasy world. People on this planet are poor. They need food. They need roads to get them food. They need their roads to get their goods to the market. There's a lot of things that we can do other than that. So I think what ends up happening is saying, yeah, in theory, I think you have the right to do NFTs. Sorry, there's some motorcycles around. You have.
I don't have an answer for that.
Oh.
Is there something else I can help?
Oh, sorry. My Apple Watch was trying to answer my questions. But yeah, I think with NFTs, I have a friend I have a friend who worked on an NFT project, and I think it's interesting intellectually to pursue it and to see what's going on and how does it work and all of that. I still think there are so many real world problems. And I wish instead of the huge boom of like Sharia compliant cryptocurrencies or Sharia compliant NFTs, there was a boom still in development studies. Like we're still in a world of development, and many Muslims are still not that well off. Or just people getting into pension funds. I think where it's taking some of the most indulgent parts of Western capitalism and beginning to copy it around the world. And yes, there's opportunity. You can probably make some money. I don't know what the value, I think it was Farid. What Farid said is there's not much value add. So yeah, I'm not in that group. They will probably hack me or something now. But yeah, I mean, my general rule is I know fatwa, but to each their own. To me, my religion, to you, your religion, and for me, mine's still in the like more of the real world. Yeah.
And on that very sensible note, it's already an hour and a half. Wondering if anyone else has anything to ask before we close. Or indeed, if Akhtar has something to say on closing.
I'd say I wrote the book. It took me 5 years to write the book. I slept maybe 5 hours a night for almost 5 years. I lost lots of weight. I lost my hair. I was very interested into it. One of the reasons why I wrote the book is after 9/11, when Islamophobia was kind of picking up, you know, when there was a thing where people who would critique Islam would take one verse of the Quran and say, see, this verse says this, look at what they did in New York or Afghanistan or Hamburg or something. Take one verse. And I wish that person would have taken their time to read the entire Quran or understand Islamic history or take their time to understand more, to contextualize it. But I also found that amongst Muslims as well. They say, see capitalism, see the West, see this. And I found it disheartening because I also consider myself, I'm in the West. All four of my grandparents passed away in Canada. My parents have their pension in Canada. I grew up there. I love it there. I find that I wrote the book to make people want to delve deeper. If you're concerned about capitalism, read capitalism. Read Adam Smith end to end, which is what I did. Every book, everything I cited, which was quite a bit, I made sure I read end to end, just like I wished people did with Islam. And I didn't have to do that, but that's why it took me 5 years. So I read Adam Smith end to end. You read Adam Smith, he's not a proponent of capitalism in that way. He critiques it. He critiques capitalism quite a bit. So if there is a takeaway, is take a step back from the noise of everything that's going on, pick a thing that you want to learn, go to Wardah Books, buy some books, and sit down, read it on your own. Go on Google Scholar, search articles, find it, there are people who are interested. There are a lot of common ground, a lot of good people doing good work. You will find them, but just don't debate in the mosque. But yeah, that's probably my parting words. Thank you for having me, Ibrahim.
Thank you so much. It's always so refreshing to have you, and look forward to having you in Singapore. I think your book is now making its way to our own list of books for book club. So next year, our book club talks about, the theme will be about Islam in the future. So I think Islamonomics really should be part of that conversation in that book club. So yeah, probably we'll meet again more next year when we talk about that book club, inshallah. And I'm looking forward to that. If you agree to it.
Inshallah, yeah, I'm in for it, and who knows, I might be going to Malaysia at the end of Ramadan to go speak at a university, and then if I'm that close, I could just pop into Singapore.
Okay,
Yeah.
inshallah.
Yeah.
Inshallah. So thank you for your time. This is a lot. You've been very generous with your time. You've been very generous with your sharing of your knowledge, and may Allah reward you. Alhamdulillah. Thank you for being here today, and thank you everyone for. We are recording this, so it will be posted on our website in a couple of days. You can check it out, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and thank you again.